Well, welcome to Agathos Ministries for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. This is Pastor Scott Conway, and we're going to have some fun today, because today we are talking about one of the more interesting things out of the Old Testament, the flood, Genesis 7 through 9, talking about the flood of Noah. Now, part of what makes it so interesting, of course, it is a very, very well-known story. Everyone talks about Noah's Ark. In fact, the idea of Noah's Ark is in pop culture. You make reference to it. People know what you mean. Most people mistakenly believe that the animals went there 2 by 2. That is partially true, but also they had 7 of every clean animal and 2 of everything else. And so there's a little bit more to it. But today we're not going to talk so much about Noah's Ark. That's going to be next time. Today we're going to focus our attention on the flood. The flood itself, some of the reasons for it, but more the logistics of it. Now this is an interesting study because there are a lot of issues with the flood. A lot of issues people don't realize are issues. So the Genesis flood, Genesis 7, starting in verse 10. And it came to pass, after 7 days, that the waters of the flood were upon the earth, in the 600th year of Noah's life. And of course, we've already talked a lot about the long lifespan of the pre-flood patriarchs. In the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. Now that's pretty specific. It gives you a year, it gives you a month, it gives you the day. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. That's a lot of water. Flooding the earth has some logistical problems. If you wanted to flood the entire planet, you've got some questions you need to answer. One, where do you keep the water to do that? If you want to flood the entire world, you want to keep some water off on the side, we're going to flood the whole planet. How do you flood the whole planet? Now, how do we flood parts of the planet? Well, we do regional floods by having too much water dumped from one part of the planet into a different part of the planet. But if you're going to flood the whole planet, you can't do that. Because if you take all the water from the ocean, evaporate it into the sky, and you rain it down over the land, you can flood areas, but you can't flood the whole planet because all the water is going to keep running back to the ocean. You can only flood parts. You can't flood the whole thing. But there appears a very, very clear indication in Scripture that the entire world was flooded. So, where do you keep the water to do that? Now, the Bible says, it tells us you had 2 sources. One source was the fountains of the deep. Okay, we've got fountains of the deep. So some water is coming up from this mysterious thing called the fountains of the deep. The implication there is a whole bunch of water was underground, and it came bursting forth from underground. And then 2 says the windows of heaven. Well, that's pretty ambiguous, isn't it? Most people understand the idea of the fountains of the deep. Okay, even today we have springs. We have springs, we have geysers, we have all these things where some amount of water comes bursting forth from underground. The windows of heaven is generally understood as referring to the rain. That the rain suddenly falling was the windows of heaven. But what if it's more than that? Every once in a while, Scripture merely hints at something that it does not explain, allowing intentionally, I believe, for a wide variety of interpretations. Now, one of the reasons for that is if you are a skeptic and you are going to assault Scripture, and one of the ways you're going to assault Scripture is by assailing the idea of the windows of heaven. Does God give you much of an opening there? Not really. You can assail interpretations of the window of heaven, but it's really, really hard to say, oh, this whole idea of windows of heaven, that's just ridiculous. You can't do that because the term is ambiguous enough to allow that phrase given a wide variety of worldviews. So if you believe that the earth is on top of this giant turtle that is swimming through this eternal sea, and that you've got 4 elephants standing on top of the turtle, and you've got this flat world on top of these massive elephants, the windows of heaven can still work for you. If you believe that you've got this ball suspended in this nothingness we call space, spinning around in circles going around a sun that likewise is spinning around a center of an entire galaxy, of one galaxy floating in this endless sea of galaxies in this cosmic universe, the windows of heaven could still work for you. So whether you're a skeptic that believes in some version of a flat earth, or you're a skeptic who believes in modern cosmology, assaulting a term as vague as the windows of heaven is very, very difficult. So a lot of the things that God does in Scripture, which is just so ingenious, I believe he does for the specific purpose of protecting his word from excessive skepticism. That some things he describes well enough, so if you have some idea what he's talking about, you go, I see. Like the idea of an expanding universe, and in Psalms he talks about he unrolls the heavens like a scroll. You go, wait a second, that could be a poetic allusion to an expanding universe. Well, God is so smart. It's like he knows. How does he know? And by the way, when I say it's like he knows, not only does he know what he's talking about, he also knows how to say it so that he can preserve his word for thousands and thousands of years without it being destroyed. Who was it? I think it might have been Voltaire at one time had said that basically the word of God was dead. That the Bible was now seen as an archaic document and its days were numbered. And that it would be decades, I think he predicted, before nobody would regard the Bible as anything more than a curious book of mythology. And I think so far he's been wrong by, 100 years, 150 years? Anyway, the people who keep predicting the end of Christianity and the end of the world and the end of Scripture have pretty consistently been wrong. God's going strong. Almost seems like God knows what he's doing. It's amazing. So back to the water issue, because boy, could I get going on that one. So back to water. So much water in the atmosphere. Now think about this. Enough water to flood the earth. Now we're even going to go with the assumption that things were flatter back then. That mountain ranges weren't as high, and things were, much more even, more of a global plain, and we're going to get into some of that. So much water in the atmosphere could double or triple the atmospheric pressure on the surface. Now that's something that a lot of lay people don't really think about. That's something that even a lot of creation scientists aren't always cognizant of. If there is all this water in the air, what does that do to atmospheric pressure? Because if the water's up there, it has mass, right? If it has mass, that means as far as, in a gravity environment, such as a planet like Earth, it has weight. That means that this mass of water somewhere up in the atmosphere is putting pressure down on the atmosphere. Now, curiously, if you were to double or triple the atmospheric pressure, that suddenly renders some beings able to fly that otherwise, aerodynamically, could not fly. The pteranodon is an example. From what I've been told, now keep in mind I am not a paleontologist or an aeronautical engineer, but from what I've been told, the pteranodon should not be able to fly. And its close cousin, the pterodactyl. But they should not be able to fly. That based upon the size of the body and the size of the wing, they could not fly unless you put them in an atmosphere with double the pressure we have now. They need the air pressure of 2 atmospheres for something of that design to be capable of flight. Is that interesting? So you watch the end of, Lost World, Jurassic Park 2? I think it was 2. Where you see the pteranodons or the pterodactyls, I forget which, flying off at the end of the movie. So that would only be possible in a double atmosphere. You would need more atmospheric pressure for that to occur. Otherwise, all they could do is glide, and they would keep sinking as they had to glide. So every time they want to fly somewhere, they would either need to find a very, very strong upward thermal, or they'd have to climb up the mountain, and then jump off and glide, and then climb up the next mountain and jump off and glide. That they couldn't just fly unless they have a greater atmospheric pressure. And that, from what I've been told, they need at least 2 atmospheres. So if they have the air pressure of 2 atmospheres, then they're capable of flight. Now here's something else that's interesting. Higher pressure also mirrors pressurized oxygen therapy that speeds the healing in many conditions. It's an expensive therapy, but basically what they have created is this giant pressurized chamber. They stick you inside, and they pump in extra oxygen, extra air. They increase the atmospheric pressure inside this chamber, and with a higher level of oxygen inside this chamber to help your body heal faster. Now, mostly it's used in sports medicine, and I've mostly heard about it being used with professional level athletes who need to recover fast. They need to be out on the field. They need to be at 100% in as little time as possible for them, because they've got millions of dollars a year at stake. And for the teams, because if they're paying these people millions of dollars a year, they're paying them because they're good. They want them back on the field as quickly as they possibly can. And the curious thing about this pressurized oxygen therapy is that, based upon reports, it can cause broken bones, torn ligaments, surgery recovery, all of that stuff to occur in about half of the time it would normally take to recover. Now think about that for a second. You've got multiple atmospheres. So now suddenly pteranodons can fly. Now suddenly pterodactyls can fly. These things are effectively grounded after the flood then, right? You've lost the atmospheric pressure. And before the flood, you've got this whole basically permanent oxygen therapy going on. You've got this extra pressure zone worldwide that helps the body recover from injury faster. You've got this whole thing that if it helps your body recover from injury, what else do you think it helps your body do? Helps your body age more slowly. You're getting a reaction like, ooh, isn't that awesome? And so it would help elongate life. People would live longer. Animals would live longer. You would more often have to be killed than you could die of natural causes. Because if your body recovers, basically what is aging? Short version of aging is your body slowly breaks down faster than it can recover. If your body slowly breaks down faster than it can recover, it will slowly degrade, and that slow degrading process that occurs over decades we call aging, getting old. That you hit your peak somewhere in your 20s or 30s or 40s. I don't know, I haven't hit mine yet, I'll let you know. But wherever it is you hit your medical peak, then you are slowly degrading after that point in time. But if this technique, medically now, can speed up the healing process, what if it can also speed up your body's recovery process from illness, injury, the normal errors that occur in your genetic code from aging, and your body recovers from that? That it magnifies the self-correcting mechanism that God engineered in your DNA and RNA process. Because there's a self-correcting function in there. The self-correcting function in there slowly degrades over decades as we get older. But what if you got to live in a 2-atmosphere condition where you're under high pressure in an oxygen-rich environment? That the oxygen is high enough to make a medical difference. Now you do have a problem. If you lower the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere at 1 atmosphere, life dies. There's not enough oxygen. So if you lower it too much, life dies. Okay, that part's obvious. Most people understand that. But if you elevate the oxygen levels too high, a fire has unlimited fuel to keep on burning because fire burns oxygen. If you increase oxygen levels in the atmosphere too high, everything can burn. Fires can rage out of control. So in order to control something like that, to make sure that your entire creation doesn't just burn, you would need to keep everything reasonably moist. Your humidity level's pretty high. In fact, you know what would be handy? If you could periodically mist everything. every day, a couple of times a day, maybe every hour on the hour. Oh, wait a minute. Doesn't the Bible say that's what happened? There was no rain, but a mist would rise from the earth. So therefore, the oxygen levels could even have been higher without having the fire problem that we would have if oxygen levels were much higher today. And you look at that stuff and go, whoa, God's a genius. How does he know this stuff? Now, here's another water problem. This is a water problem again. If you have this canopy surrounding the earth, making this double or triple atmospheric pressure thing, higher levels of oxygen maybe, so much water collapsing in a short time releases a tremendous amount of energy. That when you have something suspended and then suddenly it collapses, there's an energy release, an energy transfer that occurs. And that's based on the laws of thermodynamics. And that release of energy would heat things up. So this becomes a problem. The calculations have been done on a 2-foot thick canopy. If there was a canopy 2 feet thick of water, basically you're talking water roughly the consistency of regular surface temperature water, but otherwise spread out around the entire globe and suspended high enough up so that it's not just going to get sucked down. A 2-foot thick canopy would increase the surface temperature if it all collapsed in 40 days to about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's not terribly comfortable now, is it? Could you live at 110 degrees? Yeah, you could live. Wouldn't it be terribly comfortable? Maybe if you had like a nice enclosed area that was well insulated with good thick wood, something like that. Oh, wait a second. I think we're describing the ark now. But that aside, some models call for a 40-foot thick canopy. Now, I haven't seen any calculations for a 40-foot thick canopy other than just the simple conclusion that if the numbers on a 2-foot thick canopy would elevate surface temperature to about 110 degrees average surface temperature worldwide, what would a 40-foot thick canopy do? And the simple conclusion, of course, is that the collapse of a 40-foot thick canopy would release so much heat energy in its collapse that it would probably destroy all life. Imagine you have all of this water up in the air, room temperature water, atmospheric temperature water, and it just collapses in 40 days. You're going to drop a foot of water worldwide every day for 40 days. You could elevate the surface temperature of the planet Earth to beyond the tolerances for life. Easily. 2 feet is going to do 110 degrees. You're going to do 2 feet in 2 days? Suppose you only reach 110 degrees in 2 days, but you've got 38 feet left to go of releasing energy. That could be bad, huh? So we got a problem with that. In order to have enough water in the air to flood the Earth to the levels you would need to flood an entire planet, you would need about 40 feet of water up in the air. You could do 2 feet. You could do 2 feet. It's a little harder to do 40 feet and get away with it, based upon this model. Now, if the water bursts forth from below, okay, because we have 2 sources, right? It says, came from below, came from above. We've got 2 directions going on here. So much subterranean water would be difficult to keep underground. How do you keep that much water underground? It would likely break upward through any cracks. You couldn't keep that much water underground without having basically a perfect seal across the entire landmass of the Earth. So far, we need too much water in the sky, and we need too much water below the ground. Now, how many people think so far this sounds like a pastor preaching on the veracity of the Word of God? Sounds a little bit more like an atheistic skeptic saying, no way, huh? Mostly. Gotta figure I'm going somewhere, though, right? Always. It's me. Now, there's another theory. Another theory postulates water held in the form of ice in rings surrounding the Earth. If water is in the form of ice in rings so far beyond the gravity well of the Earth, like, in Saturn, so that it has a negligible impact on atmospheric pressure, and it's frozen, it's at the absolute zero of outer space, It solves the atmospheric pressure problem. It solves some of the energy problem because the collapse would begin in ice form. It has some of its own problems, though, too. There's always problems with any of these theories. But you know what we can do? We can use a combined source theory. The combined source theory solves all the problems. Some of the water was subterranean. How do we know some of the water was subterranean? Not all of the water? God said so. Some of the water was above the earth, windows of heaven. How do we know? God said so. In what form? Some of it could have been in a vapor canopy. Perhaps a sufficient vapor canopy to increase the atmospheric pressure on the earth by perhaps double. But not so much up there that it's going to collapse and boil the earth. Well, it wouldn't quite boil the earth, but it would certainly superheat the earth beyond the living tolerances of living beings. Some of the water was in rings, in ice. And some might have even come from elsewhere in space. Now, by the way, if you had like a giant space glacier, some massive ice chunk running around space, and that ice chunk of space drops into the world, what is the temperature of the ice when it hits the atmosphere? Absolute zero of space. Are there any ice chunks running around our universe? What do we call those? Oh, that would be a comet, huh? So we have those. Now there's a problem is that once the comet hits the atmosphere, now what happens? Friction with the atmosphere causes it to superheat on the surface. So even if it's still frozen on the inside, it's superheating on the surface. It's releasing a tremendous amount of energy from falling through our atmosphere. But as far as the total impact on the atmosphere goes, it is at least still made of ice. That doesn't offset a lot, by the way, in case you're wondering. So, here we go. Let's use a comet theory. If, now keep in mind this is a hypothesis, so we go if a comet crashed through rings. What are we assuming the rings are made out of? Some form of ice. And crashes through a canopy. So what was a canopy? Combination of water, maybe some ice particles because it's up so high. I mean, we know we get hail, we get snow. Water can freeze up there. And slams into the far side of the earth from civilization. You could explain a lot of phenomenon. For one thing, it could shatter the rings. If it shatters the rings, will there be any rings left? No, if it's a comet of sufficient size, of sufficient mass, and it crashes through rings that aren't so thick, aren't so big, that they can sustain themselves with that kind of impact, you could shatter the rings and collapse the rings under the surface of the earth. And then, no more rings. It could collapse a canopy. To maintain a canopy with that much water around the entire world would have a certain amount of fragileness to it. If you sufficiently disrupt the canopy, you could end up compressing and collapsing the entire canopy in the form of rain. It could also break the surface of the planet, and all that subterranean water that has been slowly coming out through mists and slowly coming out through springs could suddenly gush forth in these massive, uncontrolled geysers. Then the superheating of the atmosphere from the sudden collapse of the canopy, the sudden collapse of things, and the impact of a massive comet of that size would mostly occur on the opposite side of where most of life and civilization is. And that kind of superheating of the atmosphere and the impact of a comet of that size with the amount of heat that would generate from the impact would also cause most of the evaporating water from the ocean to form in the clouds for even more rain. So 40 days of rain doesn't have to just occur from the collapsing of a canopy. Now we can have massive evaporation because we just take this giant comet and we fling it into the far side of the earth. And it could also carry extraterrestrial water up to the entire mass of the comet and whatever other, ice chunks might be falling along to give even more water to help flood the earth even better. Now, how familiar are people with the Pangaea principle? Sometimes people have heard of Pangaea. Basically, all continents were one supercontinent. Okay, so we have this globe. We've got this giant ball floating in space, and you stick all the surface on one side. flat enough that there's no massive mountain range, no mountains, no Himalayas, no Alps. None of that stuff has occurred yet. It's largely just one giant surface. And right smack dab in the middle of all of that, slightly off to the left, is a massive civilization of beings. Now, if you take a giant comet and you crash it into the exact opposite side of the planet to where that massive civilization is, what will happen to the shockwave? It will pass straight through your ball, and it will erupt the other side. Who's with me? Go, oh, hey, I learned that level of physics before I graduated from high school. I get that part. So now you've got eruptions occurring. You've got the lava, the magma of the core being shocked out this way. So you could get volcanoes. You could get geysers. By the way, if you take volcanic activity and you flash it too close to the surface where you have a lot of water, what happens to the water? The water boils up. You got all kinds of cool stuff going on. Now, if all that water comes bursting forth this way, meanwhile, what's happening to the shock wave in the water? The shock wave in the water, you splash. What happens when you take a giant rock and you splash it? Which way does the water go? All directions. Now you got this going in this gravity well, in a ball, not on a flat surface like a lake. And so you get this giant ripple that comes all the way around the globe with massive tsunamis, unprecedented, crashing into every beach in the world. Imagine having, 110-foot tsunamis crashing into every single beach on every single side of this one supercontinent. So water comes rushing in on the side. Water comes bursting forth from the middle. Then you've got the superheating mostly occurring on this side, collapsing everything on this side first. So when the vapor canopy collapses on the surface over here, everything falls in over here. What's happening at the atmosphere level? Now this is big hole on the far side. So this whole collapsing canopy then gets sucked into the vortex because nature abhors a vacuum. And most of the collapse continues to occur on the other side, which then helps back up the surge from the tsunami and keeps most of the superheating of the planet occurring on the far side of where life is. Now that'd be a pretty sneaky trick. You'd have to be pretty smart to figure that thing out, to engineer all of that. God would have to know what he was doing. Who could figure? Now, wouldn't that be cool? To think maybe we have a God that will do something as bizarre as tell us there's a global flood. And as we get more and more scientific acumen and we're able to understand these things, we can look at it and say, there's no way. To which God responds, way, think about it. It could also explain the asteroid belt. How many people know that we've got Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and then we've got this massive asteroid belt? A comet of sufficient size and impact could have broken apart an entire world. Pieces could continue flying through space. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon on the planet Mars. One is the craters on Mars. Most of the craters on Mars show some evidence of mostly happening within the space of about an hour. I forget what the percentage is, but it's like 80 or 90% of the known craters on Mars have the appearance of having all occurred within about the space of 1 hour. It could also help explain where some of the water came from. And there's a provocative extra bonus. You ready for our extra bonus? Here's our extra bonus. Atlantis! Atlantis? Who's talking about Atlantis in church? Where else do you hear this stuff? Now, the legend of Atlantis is fairly simple and straightforward. The story of Atlantis is that there was a great and powerful advanced civilization. And they rebelled against the gods. And they were punished by having the whole civilization destroyed by sinking. Anyone going, that's beginning to sound a little bit familiar. Now, there's an interesting old legend out of India that most people don't know about. An old legend out of India is that their ancestors at one time waged war with Atlantis. So if you go into the folklore of the people of India, they have these ancient stories about how their ancient ancestors were at war with the people of Atlantis, of this continent that was sunk. That the parallels between it are just stunning. So by the time, the story of Atlantis amongst the Greeks and the Romans, they may have gotten that story actually out of India. Because, the Persians and the Etruscans, and, that they shared borders in common, and there was trade going on. So what if Atlantis is an apocryphal version of the pre-flood civilization of the Nephilim? The rebellion against the gods was the Nephilim rebelling against God. And the India legend is a legendary, mythological variation of the account of humans and the Nephilim at war. Is there any indication that maybe the humans and the Nephilims were at war? The whole earth was filled with violence. The humans are living for hundreds of years. And of course, how do you live for hundreds of years? In a world filled with violence, you get really good at hiding. Can't much hide while you're building an ark, or really good at fighting. And that according to the India legend, humans and these race of super beings were in a perpetual state of war for centuries. And, interestingly enough, despite the power of these super beings, they were never able to beat the humans. Now here's a few interesting snippets that aren't in your notes about the India legend. According to the legends, according to the mythological stories, this war did not merely occur on land, it also occurred in the sky. True? Not true? Who knows? But some of the mythological stories of the creation of these cloud chariots, of these flying things that could soar through the air, was considered important enough that, as far as I've heard, the Chinese government decided that they were interested enough in it to buy some of the original artifacts that depict and describe these craft and the construction of these craft. And as far as anyone knows, or so I've been told, it is in the hands of the Chinese Space Agency. That they're looking into it because they think there's at least enough merit in the idea to be worth looking at. Is that enough to make you go, Now, the flood would have the effective appearance of sinking Atlantis. You have water bursting out from the ground. You have water coming in on all of your beaches. What happens to the land relative to the water? Well, water goes above the land. We call that a flood. From the perspective of those on the land, isn't that exactly the same as the land dropping beneath the water? Yeah. And so Atlantis sinks. Atlantis gets lost beneath the waters, lost beneath the waves, lost beneath the geysers, lost beneath the volcanic activity. If the impact was literally on the opposite side of the earth, so you have that shock wave breaking things up. If it's on the opposite side of the earth of the main Nephilim civilization, it could have shattered the entire civilization and burst forth both geysers and volcanoes. If you're familiar with the legends of Atlantis, that pretty much describes it. The legendary stories of Atlantis and the story of the mighty men of renown being destroyed in the flood have a lot of similarities. Is that enough to make anyone go, wow, what if, maybe? At the very least you go, well, that's kind of curious. Almost makes you want to go look up some of the ancient versions of the stories of Atlantis and compare it to Genesis 7, 8, 9, Go take another look at some of these things. That the Atlanteans were reported of having a tremendous amount of power, a tremendous amount of technology, that they were a very, very advanced civilization. Now, where is Atlantis located? Anyone know, according to the legends, physically, where is Atlantis now? It's somewhere underwater. It sank, right? Anyone know where underwater most Atlantis theorists hypothesize Atlantis is? Somewhere off of Florida. Bermuda Triangle. There we go. But other theories place part of it in the middle of the Mediterranean. Because the Mediterranean is referred to as the Middle Sea, in the middle of the earth. Some of the theories have it off of Spain. Well, think about Pangaea again. Go back to Pangaea. Stick everything back together. Continents are back together. Now where is Atlantis? What if everybody's right? You just put Atlantis back together, didn't you? So if that was Atlantis, this vast metropolitan sprawl, the Los Angeles of its day, and you shatter the middle of your city and you rip apart your continents, now where is Atlantis? The entire Atlantic Ocean. And maybe one of the suburbs is in the Mediterranean. So you get interesting. So what if there is some truth to the story of Atlantis because it is based upon the legends passed down through history, passed through the Tower of Babel, so then we get some problems with translation as language changes, but an ancient recording of the story of what happened to the city of the Nephilim. Would that be curious? That at least should be enough to make you go, Now, many cultures have flood stories that have some similarities to Genesis. The Chinese pictogram for boat is a composite of vessel, 8, and mouth. A vessel with 8 mouths to feed. That's a curious thing. Many cultures have flood stories. Many of the flood stories have similarities to the Genesis flood story. It's common to use the universality of the stories to show that they are all myths. Because is it possible they are all exactly true? No, they can only all be exactly true if they are all exactly alike, and they're not. Or it might point to a probable real event upon which all the stories are at least loosely based. Because when you pass down stories down an oral tradition, from time to time, through the generations, would you expect there to be some shift in certain cultures that do not value the exactness of the translation of the story? If the truth that they're after is a principle, is it possible that the facts of the story could be slightly distorted to reflect the principle in a way that whatever culture they might have in that generation might more effectively understand? Yeah. When you break up the world into multiple languages, could some of it be lost in translation? Of course. So it might point to a probable real event upon which all the stories are at least loosely based. Now here's a list of some cultures with flood stories, and I do not believe this to be an exhaustive list. Sumerian, Babylonian, Jewish, Islamic, China, Lahore, Indochina, India, the Andaman Islands, Indonesia, Australia, Malaysia, the Greek, Germanic, Irish, Finnish, Aztec, Inca, Hopi, Caddo, Menominee, Micmac, Polynesian. That's a list, huh? Now, why a flood? Genesis 9, starting in verse 11. And I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood. Neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. Okay, so you pause there a moment and look, okay. And I will establish my covenant with you. God says, okay, I promise. Now try to think about this for a moment. If you're dealing with a human being coming and talking to you, okay, I'll make you a deal. I won't kill you all with water again. Would that make anybody a little bit suspicious? Does he say that I won't cut off all flesh ever again? No, he says, I shall not cut off all flesh by the waters of a flood. He specifically says, I won't use this technique again. So neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth. Doesn't say anything about fire, doesn't say anything about storms, doesn't say anything but water. No more flood. Can he still freeze the earth? Yeah. Can you still have the heat death of the earth? Can you have nuclear holocaust on the earth? So long as it's not a flood, God's keeping his promise. And so there's this provocative warning in here. It says, okay, One down. No more water. Water's not on the list anymore. But think about it a little while. Does that mean I've got nothing left? Genesis 9:12. And God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. Perpetual generations. That's a really long time. Genesis 9:13. I do set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. By the way, there's an extra little hint in there. Can the water still become a flood? Yeah. What's the only limitation? It's not going to destroy everything. I'll flood 2/3 of the earth. Genesis 9:16. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Now, by the way, this isn't God saying that, I might forget. If I don't do this rainbow thing, I might forget. It's a way of doing remembrance, like keeping a souvenir of something. It's just a reminder. It's a memory anchor. It's something that can be looked at and say, yep, that right there. That's the sign of my covenant. That's my signature. So whatever the reason, water would never be used again. Now we know from Revelation, God shows up and says, by the way, ladies and gentlemen of the earth, there will be a next time. And the next time will be by fire. The rainbow is a natural phenomenon based upon sunlight passing through water. So we're reminded of what we're told earlier in Genesis 2:5. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. And 2:6. Here we go. Solve the fire problem with multiple atmospheres and higher levels of oxygen. And I have a possible explanation for why it fled in the first place. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. What in the world does that have to do with anything? Well, if there was no rain before the flood, then water falling from the sky and flooding from below would have been new. After 1,676 years of going, whoa, what's this? Water's falling from the sky? How's that happen? Water's bursting forth from below? Okay, the mist thing. We're used to the mist thing. What's going on now? It's new. Now think about how our architecture and our technology accommodates weather. What might we do differently if there was no rain? If there was no unexpected water? Is there anything that we do the way we do because, A, our water is unpredictable, like irrigation? Anything we do to accommodate unexpected amounts of water? Anything we do to accommodate rain? Well, for one thing, you can look up. We have a ceiling on here. We have a roof above the ceiling. Why? Part of it is because of water. There's water that falls down on top of it every once in a while. Now, if you're in areas where heavy water falls, in frozen form, called snow, what do they do in a lot of areas where they can get massive amounts of snow? Will they ever build a flat roof? No, not unless you want it to collapse. That you will build, in some cases, this really, really steep arch so that the snow can't stick to it. The snow builds up, it'll slide off. It was actually funny that my aunt who lives in Hawaii was wandering around her neighborhood, and she says this new house is going up, and she's looking at the new house, and it's got this really, really steep roof, and she's wondering, now, why in the world is there this steep roof? And it just so happened that the owners of the property were there on this particular day, and so she asked them, says, well, of course you have to build a steep roof, and so that way the snow can slide off. And she's trying to explain, okay, but you're in Hilo, Hawaii now. We don't get that kind of snow in Hilo. You just need it for rain. We get a lot of rain. But we don't get snow. So it doesn't need to be that steep. Just, blueprint's already drawn up, so I'm sure they had to finish the house the way it is. Now I can go, okay, well, if there's no snow, just chop off that roof. Let's build a new one. And so it's not going to hurt you to have a steep roof, but it's just not necessary. Also, if you know there's going to be periodic flooding, do you build your houses any differently? Yeah, especially if you know there's a certain level of flooding to occur, that you do your foundations differently and you elevate your house. Are you going to build a lot of cellars in flood zones? No, not unless you want an indoor swimming pool downstairs. So you think about how our architecture and how our technology accommodates weather. And if we're going to put anything electrical outside, what do we have to do? We cover it up. We have to do a lot of things to protect it from the weather. So, back to the chronology. It was 1,676 years from Adam to the flood. Adam and Eve's brains, the physical brains, have personally been engineered by God. I mean, they didn't inherit their brains through genetics. God engineered it by hand. Bodies worked so efficiently back then that you could live for more than 900 years. So think back, even a few hundred years of modern history. What might they have invented? What might they have invented in 1,676 years? The first 950 years of that with a brain personally engineered by God at work trying to solve the problems. And then Enoch, which is Methuselah's dad, walked with God, was a contemporary of Adam, was alive for the last 300 and some odd years of Adam's life, who can go to God personally and say, okay, Lord, this is what we're working on. How are we doing? Are we okay? We're good? Really? I hadn't thought of that. That's a good idea. Really? That could happen? Okay, let me go tell them to, stop before we blow something up. I mean, Enoch could go chat with God, run by God what they're doing. God could give him a few pointers, a few warnings. Was God into technology? Was God into engineering? Was God into blueprints and designs? I don't know. Where'd Noah get his plans for the ark? If you had more than 1,500 years of development from the most intelligent people who ever lived, might they have developed some pretty good technology? Possibly. Without rain or floods, might that technology have been best wiped out by water? Possibly. Now, water-soluble technology would have made sense. A simple modern example, sandcastles. Fabulous artistic constructions that can be wiped out by rain or waves, or intentionally destroyed and redone. Now, why might you want to intentionally destroy and redo, I don't know, say your houses, if you're going to live for 950 years, and you're going to keep having kids? Okay, we live for under 100 years. When you're growing up and you want your own place, how much space do you need? Can you even share a room with somebody? I mean, are there situations where, college students will share a dorm and they'll share a common area, the quote-unquote living room with 30 other people? Yeah. Okay, now you're married. Want a little bit more privacy? At least one whole room all to yourself? Okay, now you're married and you have kids. You end up wanting a little more space? Now you're married and you're having kids for centuries at a time. And you've got 3 of them living at home, 5 of them living at home, 15 of them living at home. Are you going to want to do some add-ons? And then you decide you're done having kids, and now you have 48 kids, all grown up and out of the house. Do you still want that many bedrooms? And here's another thing to think about. Garbage. How much trash do we generate? Where do we put it all? In just a couple of 100 years of that level of civilization, of building cities in the United States of America, are we having a landfill problem? Okay. Now suppose you, personally, as an individual, are going to live for 900 years. So it's not that, it'll be somebody else's problem. No, it's going to be your problem. If in 200 years you're creating this trash problem, You've got 700 more years to live with this problem. Does that motivate you to maybe have to figure, okay, what are we going to do about this trash? I'm thinking about this. We got no place to put this trash. We can't keep moving it someplace because there's too much of it. And I'm not going to take all the time to have it hauled, thousands of miles away so that we can keep filling this stuff up for the next 700 years. And so you have to start figuring stuff out, figuring out a level of recycling that we don't really need to do today because we don't think in terms of 900-year lifespans. We think in terms of decades. And we're still trying to figure out some solutions. We're beginning to do the recycling, but how much more urgency relative to your lifespan does it take if you multiply your lifespan by 10? Try to imagine, what if you generated 10 times as much garbage, human being by human being, as we do now? Do you think we'd be a little bit more anxious to develop a more comprehensive solution? Now, using a sort of gel technology would have been one way to build in a world without rain or any unexpected water. Now, if you want an analogy to use, do we build our things with the assumption that every once in a while we have this storm of raining fire? No, of course not. That doesn't happen. Would we build things differently if from time to time, every few months during our fire season, instead of having our October fires that twice has devastated chunks of Southern California, what if it rained fire? We saw what fire can do when it starts in one particular place. What if it rained fire? Would we build things differently? Would we landscape differently? Would our vehicles be different? Would our houses and our businesses and all of our structures be different? Yeah, because you build to the environment you live in. They built to an environment where water never fell out of the sky. They built in an environment where water never, left the banks of the river. It was where it was supposed to be, and that's all the places the water was. So, were they high-tech? Maybe not, but maybe. They did have more than 1,600 years. Look at what we invented in the last 500 years. What if they had some version of our Renaissance early on? And by 600 AC, after creation, they were starting their own version of our Industrial Revolution. Our Renaissance began at about 1500-ish, plus or minus. And look at what we did out of our Renaissance. Look at our Industrial Revolution and what started to happen after hundreds of years in our Dark Ages of, for all intents and purposes, practically no advance in technology. And what we've accomplished just in the last 500 years. Do we have brains engineered personally by hand, by God? No. But we're pretty smart. We figured out a whole bunch of stuff. So what if they were starting their own version of their Industrial Revolution, say after their Renaissance, because they wouldn't have to have a Renaissance, they wouldn't have to have a reawakening, they would just have to have let's get started figuring some stuff out. We're out here, we're out of the Garden of Eden, now we got to build some stuff. Figure out, what do we want? What do we want to be able to do? How can we make life easier? Then add another 1,000 years. Now, whether the pre-flood tech is as simple as sand and mud construction, basically they're doing Adobe stuff, or as high-tech as gel-based super technology, doesn't really matter. The point, ultimately, is whatever it was all vulnerable to water because it was created in an environment where water was never a problem. So a flood would be an effective way to wipe it out, and because a flood would be an effective way to wipe out all civilization, all traces of that civilization, with just a handful of exceptions scattered here and there, God used a flood. If the technology of the day was vulnerable to water, then building an ark would have been a unique construction. Noah and his sons would have spent a century building something intended to handle rain and waves. To which you go, what? Imagine not... did anyone see... I just forgot the name. There was a sequel to Bruce Almighty, Evan Almighty, where he's building this ark. So at least when you build an ark, in this day and age, we know what an ark is for. It's a giant boat. What if someone was building this giant structure, and he's been handed some blueprints on how to build the structure, and the purpose of the structure was to handle rainfall of fire, and was designed to float in magma, was being engineered to catch thermal updrafts for magma. We might be watching someone build it and go, what the heck is he doing? Is he nuts? Magma. Oceans of magma. Come on. Acid and fire falling from the sky? Come on. That's never happened. In 1,676 years, that's never happened. Are you nuts? I mean, that's how odd this construction was. If there had never been rain, there had certainly never been a very, very severe storm. If they had boats, I mean, think about how we build our boats. We build our boats with certain assumptions. Because we have wind, we have rain, we have storms, we have all the stuff that goes on. We build our boats taking all that into account. What if none of that ever happens? And even if you have boats, you're not going to build your boats to withstand much. It'd be dramatic over-construction to build it to withstand something that never, ever happens. It'd be like if I wouldn't go out driving unless I had my car equipped as a roving assault tank. I mean, why would I do that here? Imagine if I'm looking at our military assault vehicles that we use in the middle of wartime, and I am unwilling to go driving unless I had it, because just in case, you never know. People would look at me like I was nuts. And I would be nuts. Unless I had some inside information. Now, if suddenly every single human being in the intelligence community and who has a really, really high security clearance suddenly puts bulletproof glass in all of their vehicles, then maybe it's time to worry. But if just one random guy's doing it, you go, okay, you're a little bit on the crazy side, aren't you? So what? So what? So what? It's interesting, but pondering all these questions begs the typical Agathos question. So what? How do we use these considerations, these insights, these ponderings as part of our day-to-day lives? Well, for one thing, and this is typical anytime you find anything interesting, we go, whoa, God's a genius. It magnifies our respect for God. It magnifies our respect for His genius. It magnifies our respect for pondering what might be possible, and by making self-consistent assumptions, it can guide our creation of technology. It can give us some insights on how to search for scientific truth, how to search for technological insights. And with some thought, you can go deeper and find a great many insights that can be helpful in modern life. Now, we'll discuss this in our discussion groups, but just think about the implications of all of this. If instead of just being skeptical, saying, well, no, that couldn't happen because, like, okay, let's take a look at the because and let's think. Suppose it really did happen. Suppose it really is true. How could you take what else we now know is true and combine it with this story, which we believe to be true, and have the story still be true in light of what we now know is also true? And then you start to figure things out. And as you start to figure things out, you might go, whoa, that's pretty cool. Now, here's part of how I use that thought process in day-to-day life. Sometimes you hear multiple stories from people, don't you? People will tell parts of stories, their side of a story. Has anyone ever heard someone tell just their side of a story? Wendy's on her way to the San Diego Police Department. Imagine her as a detective. And she listens to one person say, I saw that yellow car come screeching down the street, and then crash! It slams, and there's an explosion of car parts, and screaming and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Talks to someone else and says, I saw the red car barreling up the street, and then there was a screech and a crash! And you get, okay, these people are obviously lying. This person says there was a yellow car. That person says there was a red car. There's no way! Well, if there was a crash, how many cars minimum do you need for cars to crash? 2. What if one of them's red and one of them's yellow? Problem solved, right? I mean, that's a pretty obvious example. Just because one person says they saw a yellow car and someone else says they saw a red car doesn't mean that they're lying. It's just one of them saw the yellow car in the crash and one of them saw the red car in the crash. and the cars crashed. When you start looking at deeper things like this, you start to reconcile more subtleties in stories. You start to try to figure out how could it be possible? What principle is at work behind the scenes here? Now, is that helpful in dealing with people? Has anyone ever heard, maybe children tell their side of a story? Now, you know there's massive gaps left in the story. You know very often that their lame excuses clearly can't be the truth. And how do you know the lame excuses can't be the truth? Because you know enough about how things work to know that could not have happened that way. I don't know, it just fell over all by itself. I was all the way over here across the room sitting on my hands. I wasn't touching anything. And you take a few truths, like one, it is not in your nature to sit down on the couch, sitting on your hands, doing nothing. That's just not who you are. 2, the laws of physics say that you will not be sitting on the couch on the far side of the room, sitting on your hands, and all of a sudden, what? The lamp leaps to its death. It's so despondent. It can't take it anymore. All by itself, because we know lamps don't do that. And then trying to explain the presence of the football in the room, too, can be a little bit troubling. So how does the football fit in? I don't know, which means they're not sophisticated enough to be able to factor in the football yet to their story, but give them some time. They'll come up with something. At the moment, the best they've got is lamp suicide. But with some thought, you can start to put some pieces together. And then when you're dealing with more sophisticated half-truths, and by understanding principles at a deeper and deeper level, you can start to sort more things out. The thought process used to arrive at these hypotheses is more useful than the hypotheses themselves. But even the hypotheses themselves are useful for the direction for scientific inquiry and the direction for technological innovation. In fact, are we beginning to develop gel technology? Yeah, are we beginning to develop wetware? Not just hardware, wetware. And we're beginning to figure out to take tech to the next level, to accomplish things that we cannot do effectively with what we've got, largely because of the amount of heat generated by hardware. One of the solutions is wetware, because it can operate self-insulated, much cooler. And we begin to figure that out. You think, what if, how long have we been working on these things? What if, before the flood, they were working on those things because they ran into the same problems? They're going, this is generating way too much. This thing's going to break in like 5 years. Okay, now, when you're going to live to be less than 100, something that lasts 5 years, that's not bad, but, it's not great. If you're going to live to be 900, something that only lasts 5 years, you're thinking, how many of these things am I going to need? Between now and the time I die, I'm going to be buying 20 of these things a century. For 9 centuries. I don't want to buy 180 laptops. We just got to figure out how to make these things last longer, because if my laptop doesn't last at least 25 years, come on. It's hardly worth having. I barely get all my photos transferred onto it and all my iTunes files, and I need a new one already. I got my playlist here of my 17 years of music. And so it lets us think differently. It expands our thinking, and that expanded thinking helps us analyze reality in less hypothetical levels. The great thing about this is it doesn't matter if you're right or you're wrong. No. But the exercise in thinking helps you exercise similar types and levels of thinking in your day-to-day life, to figure things out. So you watch someone behaving oddly, and you go, okay, well, what do I know of this person? What do I know of how psychology works in general? What underlying facts would explain this behavior? I have sometimes been accused of being a tremendously intuitive counselor, that I will ask some questions about odd things. Like I'll ask questions about, particular individuals doing particularly heinous things to a particular person within a particular age range. Well, if you understand enough about human psychology and you look at a behavior and begin to realize, okay, this kind of behavior is commonly explained by this sort of event happening in someone's life and then reacting poorly because they've still hung on to it. And this is part of their reaction. I mean, here's an obvious one. I was training a woman in buck and roll, a jiu-jitsu technique how to get someone off who's on top of you, pinning you down. And as is very often the case, especially with women, if I don't have other women to work with someone, I'll do it. And I'll do it because I know I can control it. I know I have the trust in the relationship and the connection. This one particular woman, she lay down on her back, and I got on top of her, and she was fine, and I pinned her down. And she freaked. Now, I had to keep her under control, because, she, violently freaked out. Fortunately, I was the only one in the room that could control her freaking out without having to physically restrain her, because, what's she reacting to? Having a man on top of her, pinning her down. So is physically restraining her going to help this pass? No! So you have to be able to control it in a way that doesn't make her freak out more. Now, without me even needing to go into too much detail, without you even needing to go to this lesson's level of depth of analysis, can you guess the sort of trauma that may have existed sometime in this woman's history that would lead to that kind of reaction? She didn't react that way when a woman pinned her down. She only reacted that way when a man pinned her down. And so I talked to her about it. She had no recollection of anything ever happening to her. Okay? Does that mean nothing happened? No, because after talking to her more, there were actually 2 years of her life she could not account for. That she knew she had been through those years because she got through those grades in school. She got on to middle school. But all of 5th grade and all of 6th grade were just missing from her memory. She had little snippets here and there, and there was a particularly odd thing about those snippets. She realized when she pondered them that she had no recollection of 2 particular men in her life. A father and an uncle. They were just gone from her memory. Not even just for those years, but for about a year beforehand and a couple of years afterwards. Go, Does that begin to tell you, well, maybe we have something going on there that might warrant some counseling? Counseling, incidentally, that is beyond the scope of what I can do as a pastor. That's a level of counseling you need someone who is specialized in that sort of thing and knows what they're dealing with. Now, I would monitor the counseling going on because there's a lot of bad ways to do that. But as far as getting into it and really dealing with it, I would probably refer that one out. But you can see this way of thinking, of being able to hypothesize with an understanding of principles and concepts, saying what are the problems, what are the issues, what would explain this? What are the top 3 rational explanations? How could you blend explanations to arrive at a more complete holistic picture? What assumptions are you going to make? Are you going to look at one problem and go, the Word of God lies! Because you found a problem. Or you're going to try to solve the problem. Or you find a chain of problems. Because we the Gothos assume that the Bible is the Word of God, we look for the explanation. And we try to avoid the easy one. The easy one is, well, God's God, He can do what He wants. Okay? That may be true, but that's not terribly helpful now, is it? So, well, it's God, He could just make it a miracle. Okay, once again, true, but not particularly helpful. But when you think about it, when you analyze it, when you assume that God is a genius God, and that God has an agenda to minimize miracles, that He wants to minimize how much He intervenes in His reality to suspend the laws of reality, to suspend the laws of cause and effect, and how He crafts and He engineers all of these things in just fabulously subtle ways to accomplish all of His ends using as little miracle power as possible. If you analyze that and you consider this, what if God flooded the earth by slamming a comet into exactly the far side of the earth from the Nephilim civilization? But God isn't a God of miracles in the sense that He's always looking for an excuse to do a miracle. He likes to do things very mechanically if He can. And so God put this comet in its orbit to exactly hit the earth. Does that take a lot of math? Could we build a giant ecliptic orbit for a comet to aim it at this planet, to hit it on this particular date? This exact day of the year. This exact time of the day. We can't be off by 3 hours or we're going to explode the wrong civilization. If we erupt one of these geysers right underneath the ark, we just blew up our own ark. If we erupt a volcano right underneath the ark, we just fried our own wooden construction here. We needed to explode through the Nephilim civilization. We hit in this very narrow range of hours because if we're off by a few hours, we destroy all life on the planet, and we really want that boat to survive. We have to aim it at a tiny blue marble spinning around space. And just to make it interesting, we're going to destroy this planet on the way in to make an asteroid belt. We're going to crash into Mars on the way in, just to have some more fun, and we won't get into the reasons why. We're going to flood Mars while we're at it, and evaporate the water off of Mars, aim it right at the Earth. We're going to flood the planet Earth. We're going to destroy all life except for this one tiny little boat. And we are going to put all of these exact pieces, and by the way, we have to hit the day because we did the prediction from Methuselah's death. Methuselah's lying in bed going, okay, Methuselah's gone. Comet hits. Game on. That takes a heck of a lot of math now, doesn't it? Especially if you're going to bank it off Astra. We're going to pass right by Mars on the way to Earth. That's pretty slick, huh? Doesn't that give you a whole level of respect for God? And he factors all that in, knowing that the chain of free will choices made by man and made by the sons of God, made by the serpent, all of those free will choices are all going to unfold. So on this day of this month of this year, when the bank shot off of this planet, crossing this planet to drop down onto this planet, we're going to flood the Earth within a small time frame of these 2 or 3 hours. And in the beginning, when God creates the heavens and the earth, he puts all of that into place. That's pretty slick now, huh? Now, what's easier, for God to do that or for God to be standing up on the moon with this big comet in his hands, packing up his giant snowball and just flinging it in the earth? I mean, that takes power. That doesn't take genius. I mean, now you're getting to like Zeus stuff, where Zeus would stand up there with his bag of lightning bolts and hurl them down at people. God doesn't need to do that. God can engineer all this stuff at the beginning. Now, before I wrap up, one more slick little thing. Just in case you want, one more slick little thing. Then all of the whole Astra thing, breaking up an entire planet, asteroids running around and all that stuff, and your regular meteor showers and whatnot. Fast forward to Joshua, where he's got this battle going on. I think it was up against the Amorites. And this rain of fire, meteors and bolides, big enough hitting the atmosphere to survive hitting the earth, aimed at the Amorites that are in battle with the Israelites. And you're going to miss your guys, and you're going to hit the other guys. Now, if God has his whole baseball team of angel pitchers up there, hucking rocks down to the Amorites, you're okay, well, you know, no big deal. Power, but no big genius. What if all of those were put in motion from breaking up Astra, forming the asteroid belt, from this comet impact right here? So not only is God taking a bank shot off of Astra on the way to flooding the earth, but he's also putting in flight all of the meteors and all of the bolides that are going to kill Amorites in another, I don't know how long was that, 1,000 years. And meanwhile, for that several hundreds of thousands of years, all these rocks are going to be flying around space, but on this particular day, at this particular time, on this particular battlefield, they're going to hit those guys, but not those guys fighting those guys. Imagine you're the Israelite, sword to sword, shield to shield, bang, 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 and then the rock just goes poof, hits the guy you're fighting, misses you, and you're looking around, and it misses all of your guys, and it's just wailing on the other side. Once you go, whoa. Would it be a lot easier to believe in a bunch of angels standing somewhere up there in the clouds hucking rocks at these guys than it would be to think that maybe thousands of years ago, at the dawn of creation, when God created the heavens and the earth, he put in motion a comet that was going to bank off of this planet, was going to cross over Mars, was going to flood the earth, And at the same time, he was going to leave debris from this planet running around the cosmos for thousands of years to crash into this particular guy at this particular moment, aimed at him, not at you. And God did that in Genesis 1:1. Would anyone look at that and go, oh, wow, God's so smart. He's a genius. Does that shift your respect for God? It's one thing to think of God as powerful enough to step in and suspend the laws of creation, to intervene in physics. It's a whole different level of genius to think that what if God is so smart in his omniscience, in his infinite genius, in his infinite wisdom, to engineer all of this, combining his perfect knowledge of everything that would happen and a level of sophistication to his mathematics, that he could set that up for this particular day, this particular time, to hit that particular guy from debris from a planet he smashed with a comet when he flooded the Earth way back when. Anyone impressed? I couldn't do it. I doubt we could make those kind of calculations with the best supercomputer that we've got. That would be pretty darn slick, if you ask me, because God is a genius. Now, next time, we're going to talk about the logistics of the ark. So, that's part of our... But wait! There's more! The logistics of the ark. Next time. Father God, we praise you, we glorify you, we honor you as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You are a genius. And we will worship and glorify you and trust you as such. That if you are so genius, Lord, that you could do these things, we can certainly trust. We can certainly trust that you know what you're talking about. And we praise you, Lord, for the trust and for the faith that builds in us from that knowledge. In Jesus' name.